I'm Ken Williamson, and with my wife Stephanie, we own a house here in Yachats, and we spend as much time in there as we can. And I have to say, today was about as beautiful a day as you could possibly expect. So, it's a great place to live. As Jerry said, I used to be a professor at Oregon State University of Environmental Engineering. Was there for a short 40 years. I like to think I had an impact on the place, but one of the important impacts I did have is that I did hire some really smart people in the time that I was there. And our speaker tonight is one, Todd Jarvis. I met Todd in 2004. At that time, I was director of what was known as the Water Resources Research Institute. There is a Water Resources Research Institute in every state in the U.S., plus in all places like Puerto Rico. These are funded every year with a small amount of money from the federal government to try to promote a variety of activities around improved water resources management. And what's interesting about the Water Resources Institutes is they were actually started by Senator Hatfield a number of years ago. And they've been maintained ever since, and they have done a tremendous amount of good work, and especially in bringing new students into the whole field of water resources management. At that time, we were looking for an assistant director, and Todd applied for the position, and we hired him in 2004. And he ultimately then moved on and has become the director of the Water Resources Institute at Oregon State University. Todd came when he was starting his PhD work at Oregon State University. He came to study in a program on conflict resolution. And in Oregon State University, there are these small centers around that are really quite excellent. And that's what anybody ever says about this group who does conflict resolution, led by Aaron Wolf. Now, if you think about all the conflict that we have in the state of Oregon around the water, you can imagine what it is internationally in places where the water is really scarce. And so this group of people at Oregon State works internationally. Todd has taught internationally and worked on conflict resolution. He ultimately got his PhD in geosciences at Oregon State and is now a faculty member there, advising graduate students doing research. So in the water resources field, a lot of the problems that we have are associated with what is known as paradigms, or ways in which we think about how systems work. And these paradigms drive our thinking and often get us into boxes that limit how we look at various alternatives. Here on the coast, there is no doubt that we have issues around water supply, especially during the summer. And one of the things that we're looking at on the coast right now is some sort of regional water resources process by which the communities would be linked together. And if you want to pick up Jim Adler's brochure, it's over there talking about how people are trying to deal with this issue. If you look at the limited amount of water that's on the coast, okay, one of the paradigms that we have is, well, our reservoirs are too small. Certainly in Yachats, you look at our reservoir, it's too small. If you look at the limited amount of water rainfall that we have during the summers, and if you look at the ever-increasing demand that is occurring here, and we all know that will increase in the future. So there is this issue about where will we get our water supply in the future? How reliable will it be? So in relation to the paradigms, one of the things that people generally do not think about is, could we get drinking water from aquifers off the coast? And that is sort of an international paradigm. I mean, people don't think about drilling off the coast to to develop water supplies. And that's the topic that Todd is going to talk to us about. So Todd has a graduate certificate in conflict resolution from the University of Utah. He has a PhD from OSU, runs the Water Institute, and has 25 years of experience in groundwater development. So with that, I'll turn it over to Todd, and he's going to take us on this very interesting topic tonight about an alternative paradigm to finding water on the coast. Could we drill off the coast and use the aquifer water that's there? Thank you.
Well, thanks, Ken, for that warm introduction. Thanks for hiring me at OSU. It was wonderful working with you there. We miss you, even though you still stop by every now and then to make sure, keep us honest. I've been following your water situation in the news, primarily through the Mid-Coast Place-Based Planning Program. It's been getting a lot of press because you're one of the few programs that the Oregon Water Resources Department has funded. And I know that there's the outcome of that was to perhaps the governor's office has awarded the community of Newport to about $4 million to further develop the concept of maybe building a dam on Rocky Creek. And I'm also aware of the funding. It actually looks like it might cost about $70 million to build something on Rocky Creek. One of the things that I recognized was when I started seeing the information come out in the news with respect to the results of the planning process, it seems like we're looking inward. We're looking to the east, to the Coast Range, to try to figure out a way to solve some of the water problems. One of the things I think is a challenge with respect to that is as Ken alluded to, the watershed is, most of the time, are pretty small. We're looking at highly fractured rocks associated with a very young geology, associated with an active plate margin. And one of the other things that we have to start thinking about is, darn these fish. They need to be considered with respect to the design. But more importantly is now we have this new change. And the change has been the occurrence of harmful algal bacteria. And it doesn't matter where we're located. I live in the Willamette Valley, although I live in Monmouth, which is a groundwater-based system. Salem is right next door. Salem is using a surface water supply. And I remember going to Salem and looking at some of the taps at the restaurants to get a drink of water, and they had little signs there saying, don't drink the water because of the harmful algal bacteria problem. And so when we look at these reservoirs, we're starting to look at, they have some baggage with them. And I'm not here tonight to tell you that I'm against dams. I study dams a lot in my career. But one of the things that I wanted to suggest is maybe the solution is offshore. Maybe we're entering the new freshwater frontier by looking at options both for water supply and offshore aquifers, but we can also potentially store water under the ocean in these offshore aquifers as well. Now, my presentation is organized so that I can give you an introduction that I'm not a newbie to looking at water problems on the coast. Since I joined OSU, I've been studying it intermittently, and what I'm going to show you is there's not a lot known with respect to the groundwater resources on the Oregon coast. The other thing I'm going to share with you this is not a new topic that I've been presenting, but it's been met with some resistance, understandably so, just because it is kind of a new paradigm. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to do some myth busting with you. I wanted to share some of the myths that I've been introduced to that I'd like to dispel. And then third, I'd like to share with you tonight that I think the timing of doing something radical is good now with respect to some of the political situations, both at the federal level as well as within the state of Oregon. First, what do we know a lot about coastal groundwater resources? Well, I'm going to argue we don't know not a whole lot. All right, so I was involved with the Institute for Natural Resources and the Sea Grant program when in 2005, what we did was we tried to just do an inventory of the coastal water systems. Who's using groundwater? Who's using surface water? That's how sophisticated this analysis was. All right? Because it wasn't known. So we did it. The next step, maybe some of you were aware that the state of Oregon was kind of a latecomer to having a statewide water plan. And so in 2008, the Institute for Water and Watersheds, in concert with the Institute for Natural Resources and the Sea Grant program, we conducted what were called statewide water roundtables, where we went to strategic locations across the state to listen to people as to what were the issues that most concerned them in their backyard, what would they like to see in a statewide water plan. And the results of that was ultimately led to the Oregon Water Resources Department creating the Integrated Water Resources Strategy in 2012, and then it has since been updated in 2017. I had a graduate student looking at trying to figure out a way to regionalize small coastal water systems in the north part of the coast, primarily at Seaside and Gerhardt. This was, again, one of these projects coordinated with Sea Grant, but the idea was, geez, if we're going to have something like a Cascadia magnitude 9 earthquake and we're going to have a tsunami, what are you going to do with respect to your water supplies? Go it alone, or are you going to try to come up with a way to share water in the course of an emergency? So this was looking, I think, at one of the very first steps of actually regionalizing water systems within the coastal region. In 2017, I had another graduate student helping with the State Parks Department through the Water Resources Graduate Program, looking at Darlingtonia's Wayside Park. There was concern that the little plants were looking kind of sick. We were wondering, is this a function of development in the area? Is it a function of on-site wastewater systems contributing to the water quality in the groundwater, because most of the area was being serviced by individual wells and individual on-site wastewater systems? Or could it be something connected to sea level rise, because that has been occurring? And then recently I've been working with an honors student in the Chemical, Biological, and Environmental Engineering program at OSU, who has a very sincere interest in what's going on in Forest Lake down near Bandon. His family has a summer home there, and they're just worried about their water quality. But again, what I'm underscoring is there's just not a whole heck of a lot known about what's going on the coast. Maybe that's not a surprise to you. It surprised me, just given how many people live on the coast. So the first thing that I get a lot is, well, Todd, you can't do anything on the Oregon coast. It's closed to drilling. And it was closed to drilling. It was closed to drilling, oil and gas drilling. And the person who started this all off was the state geologist in the 1960s named Hollis Dole. And Hollis Dole, I think at the time, the reason that he was concerned about it was about the time that he was being recruited by the Nixon administration to write the rules and regulations for offshore drilling in the United States. There was an oil spill, and the oil spill was down in Santa Barbara. Perhaps some of you remember it, but it made big news where kids were walking on oil balls on the beach and the like. And I think he carried that horror story to Washington, D.C. with him and wrote the rules and regulations that literally closed the Pacific Northwest coast to further oil and gas drilling. So that was in the late 60s when that occurred, and almost 50 years to the year, the Trump administration reopened the Pacific Northwest coast to oil and gas drilling under the guidance of Interior Secretary Zinke. Now, what makes this really interesting is Zinke actually is a University of Oregon graduate, and he was a graduate with a degree in geology before he became a Navy SEAL. I don't know if it's what that connection is. It just seems so interesting that there's an Oregonian who's now throwing the door open on the Oregon coast. And then there was concern with respect to, again, oil and gas drilling. We saw an executive order eventually turn it into Senate Bill 256 with respect to closing the Oregon coast to oil and gas drilling, but it's only closed to oil and gas drilling and sulfur exploration. There's a clause in the law that says that the area is still open for scientific or academic research. Any geologic survey activities that the State Department of Geology and Mineral Industries is interested in. So the door's not completely closed, it's still open to do some research with respect to maybe trying to expand a paradigm. The other myth that I would want to share with you is that Oregon's water is not for sale. This idea of selling water was actually originally proposed by Senator David Nelson in Pendleton. And at the time, he was looking at trying to sell some of the Columbia River as a way to pay for education in the state of Oregon. Of course, being a Republican from the east side of the state, it wasn't warmly received by the state, but it was really an interesting idea. Now, the reason that I think it's an interesting idea is because I'm going to make the pitch tonight that I think this might be one way to sell this idea of perhaps drilling or exploring for a water offshore. The other myth that I wanted to share with you is that there is no offshore drilling along the Oregon coast. So this map that you're looking at is from the State Department of Geology and Mineral Industries, and there's about 700 oil and gas exploration wells that have been drilled in Oregon. And if you look offshore, there's about 7 wells, and they span from the northern part of the coast near Astoria all the way down near Coos Bay, all right? So there's already been some work done offshore back in the 1960s. What's interesting and what's a real bonus with respect to this crazy idea that I'm pitching is that all the data from these oil and gas exploration wells is online. It's all archived by Dogami. Anybody can find it. All right. So what does that include? It includes all of the paperwork with respect to permitting the well. It includes the daily reports of drilling individual wells. It includes all of the geologic logs, and it includes all the geophysical data. It's all right there. It's just been sitting there, and I don't think anybody's really looked at it too carefully. So we're not starting with a blank sheet of paper on this concept. The next myth that I want to dispel is that there's no fresh water under the ocean. The map that you're seeing here is from a paper that was published in Nature, the journal Nature, back in 2013. And what you're seeing is the locations of places where oil and gas exploration wells were drilled, where they found fresh water. And fresh water is defined as something on the order of less than 5,000 parts per million of total dissolved solids. Now, the drinking water standard for comparison is a lot less than that. For most drinking water systems, they're striving for 500. It can be accepted to be at about 1,000 parts per million. But again, we're not looking at seawater that they're finding in the subsurface, which is, for comparison, about 30 to 35,000 parts per million. What's interesting about this map is that you find that most of the wells that were reported in this particular report are on the passive margins of the tectonic plates, meaning that there isn't a subduction zone where they've been drilling, except for maybe in Peru. That's an active plate margin. We have an active plate margin off the west coast of North America. Now, what makes that significant with respect to this work is that most of the places that they've identified relatively fresh water in these offshore wells is that these are in sand and gravel deposits, whereas on an active margin like we have, we're actually looking at a combination of sand and gravel deposits as well as the bedrock that we see forming the outcrops in the coastal highlands. All right, so what you see in the coastal highlands actually extends beneath the ocean. The other myth that I want to dispel is there's no groundwater offshore Oregon. So now what you're seeing here is if I took a cake knife and sliced it vertically through the Earth's crust underneath the ocean, this is what it looks like with respect to how the rocks have been contorted and faulted in the subsurface. Now this isn't wishful thinking. This is based off of very extensive and expensive seismological surveys that were conducted by the oil and gas companies for exploring for oil and gas targets offshore Oregon. The other thing is this is also tied to some of the wells that were drilled offshore, many miles offshore. Now the most important thing that I'd like to share with you on this particular diagram is you probably see that blue stripe across the top. That's the ocean, right? The water column is about 300 feet offshore. What's important about that is this. Peter Clark is a climate change expert and professor at Oregon State University. He calculated that it's taken 30,000 years for that water level to rise 300 feet. What does that mean? It means that 30,000 years ago, all of the rocks offshore Oregon were actually exposed to the elements, right? Meaning that they were exposed to rainstorms and they were exposed to floods. And we know, based on the geologic history of Oregon, that Oregon experienced massive flooding. So a massive amount of fresh water was actually discharged in this area before it was inundated with a sea level rise. The drilling targets that I'm proposing are the volcanic rocks. And the volcanic rocks on this geologic cross-section are the bright orange, relatively shallow, the maroon-colored rocks right here, and then I believe the sedimentary package right here more than likely represents the results of the Missoula flood deposits. So I think we have three different targets to look at here. And again, we have relatively high confidence that these rocks exist because they've already been drilled. And we have the drilling records from the offshore oil and gas wells. What I look at as a hydrogeologist is when I know that they are not looking for water. And so in the 1960s, they wouldn't be reporting water. In fact, they would be swearing if they found water, all right? They're looking for oil and gas. But they're also they take such great care with collecting the data from these wells because they're so expensive to drill. And it's a relatively frontier area, so they're trying to collect all the data that they possibly can get. So the data that is actually archived in the state's files is indicating to me, as somebody who's interpreting these logs, as to where there is permeability in the form of fractures, the same type of fracture permeability that we are relying upon on the aquifers that we're developing here onshore, the volcanic rocks. We're looking for interflow zones where the volcanic rock layers were laid on top of one another, and we're also looking for where they've been deformed. Now, in this particular setting, you can see these rocks have been folded into arches. And when you think about something that's really rigid, and we fold it into like a plate of glass, and we arch it, it's going to shatter, all right? That shattering is actually recorded in these well logs. The other thing that they also record is when they have a drilling problem. Where did they start to lose the drilling circulation? That's telling us that area where they've lost drilling circulation is capable of accepting water, the drilling fluids. All right, so that's another hint. The permeability architecture is there. Has anybody collected any water offshore to prove the notion that there may be usable water from the aquifers offshore? And the answer is no, not yet. The other myth that I've been working around is this issue that people think that the seabed is undisturbed. So what I did was I recruited an undergraduate student who was interested in just doing a very simple geographic information systems research project. And I asked him, would you please just look offshore, point the butterfly net in any direction that you want with respect to collecting the digital data, and tell me what is located offshore Oregon in less than 10 weeks, because we operate under 10-week terms. And so here's what he came up with. There's World War II era unexploded ordnance disposed off of the coast of Oregon. All right? There is a tangled web of telecommunication cables off the coast of Oregon. The offshore wells that we've been using for reference are right here. All right. We also know there's a wave energy test site that's quite exciting. We know a little bit about some of the marine reserves, and this is far from being complete. We're just showing these for discussion purposes only. And I read in the newspaper recently that there's a wind energy company that's very interested in building floating turbines in the offshore south of Coos Bay. All right, so this is a busy place. This is a busy corridor of industry. So the seabed has been disturbed. It was disturbed in the 1960s with the first oil and gas exploration wells. And since that time, it's been disturbed by other activities. Now, this map is also kind of illustrative of people who say, well, we're really worried about the other creatures that might be relying on that fresh groundwater that may be discharging in the ocean. Do you know anything about that? And the answer is no. That's part of our research enterprise, is to capture questions and to go investigate it. But I do think, based on this map, we finally have got some hints as to where the groundwater may be discharging. And it's probably in the marine reserves. And the reason I'm suggesting that is when we have this geochemical reaction between freshwater and seawater, we get a precipitation. And the precipitation creates something that's called hard grounds. And the hard grounds are typically where fish like to hang out and breed. All right, so I think this might be the very first hint that we were starting to get a feel for where the offshore groundwater may be discharging. The other myth that I've been wrestling with is that this is a very expensive proposition, and I'm not going to say it isn't. But I'm going to show you that I think, in comparison to other projects that are underway, both in Oregon and coastal regions in California, where actually this might be a pretty cheap proposition. So number one, we're dealing with about 300 feet of water on the Stonewall Bank. I think the estimated cost per well would be probably starting on the order of about $10 million. And I'm basing that off of the work that the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution is doing offshore on the East Coast. Their research wells are on the order of 10 to 12 million apiece. They're dealing with shallower water. They're only dealing with 150 feet. I don't know what the relationship with respect to costs will be between those varying depths, but I think that's on the order of magnitude that we're starting with. Now, these costs could rise upwards to $100 million, just depending on what we want to do with an offshore well. There's a lot of things that we can do with an offshore well other than just drill a single hole. We can also drill very deep, because the most expensive part of doing any of this work is just getting the rig to the location. We could set up a research enterprise that combines with other research enterprises, meaning maybe if we get closer to the subduction zone with a deeper well, it'll help our researchers on earthquake prediction. Or maybe we can do some work with respect to combining it with a wave energy project, or maybe a large wind turbine on the drilling platform. The other thing that's a real plus once we set up a drilling rig offshore is we're not limited to just drilling a single hole. Once we have a platform, the drilling technology that's available today allows us to drill in many different directions, and we can drill horizontally for many, many thousands of feet. All right? So it's not a one-stop shop. Is there something there? Is there nothing there? It's actually, once we get started, we have a lot of options to explore, not only water productivity, but maybe this might be an option for actually storing water underground, under the ocean. It's called aquifer storage and recovery. It's never been thought of trying to stick water under the ocean for storage. But we're doing a lot of it onshore. In fact, Oregon is one of the leaders in aquifer storage and recovery. but nobody's really thought about doing it under the ocean. Could we do it? I think once we get started, we could actually explore that. Or the other option that we have is we're always trying to figure out where can we safely store this carbon that we're generating. So maybe this might be an option for exploring for places to store carbon. And this idea of storing carbon under the ocean is not a new idea. The Norwegians have been doing it in the North Sea for quite a long time. Now, for comparison, there's a project that's underway that's a private-public partnership in Monterey. They're looking at combining desalination with a groundwater project. This is not a very large community. It's a very wealthy community, I might add, but it's not a very large community. And they're looking at a $300 million price tag for that desal groundwater project. So we're looking at, if we're successful in pulling off a groundwater exploration and development that's offshore off the coast of Oregon, this may be considerably cheaper than a desal project. All right, this may be a little difficult to read, and the reason it's difficult to read is I'm a realist. I know I'm not going to be able to pull a stunt off like this under the banner of Oregon State University alone. I'm going to have to bring in all of the flagships, right? All the flagship universities to get participation. And many of them have expertise that will actually help with push this project forward. The University of Oregon are experts in coastal and marine law. I think there's some room for their expertise if we start to move offshore to look for water to drink or to store water or to store carbon. All right. The other thing that I think is an opportunity is how would we get the water onshore, or the water onshore, offshore, if we're going to store it? Well, there's floating pipeline technology that already exists. But what we need to do is we need to figure out a way to downsize it from the standpoint of scaling the pipeline technology for smaller scale operations. I'll give you an example. Turkey is currently providing all of the drinking water to Cyprus, and they're doing that through a floating pipeline. Cyprus needs a massive amount of water, not just from a single well. And so the pipeline technology already exists. The floating pipeline is actually tethered to the ocean floor. Now, if you think about it, this makes a lot of sense, especially in an area that may be experiencing shaking, is to have something that's a little bit more flexible than a rigid pipeline, made out of concrete, made out of steel, right? And then I promised you that I would come back to this issue of selling water. I think this may be an opportunity that if we're successful, we might actually have to integrate a college of business from either U of O, PSU, or OSU to think about how would we market and sell this bulk water. We have a lot of people that are very interested in Oregon's water. You probably remember the story of Nestle trying to build a bottled water plant in the Columbia River Gorge for over 10 years. I mean, that's persistence personified, right? 10 years, and then they still were told, take a hike. Well, so we know the world's going to need water. If we find a good resource, why not have somebody come up and just buy the water on a tanker and say, take it wherever? We can sell this water and pay some of the state's bills. So that's a way that we try to monetize a project to show some return that gets not only the federal government excited, the state government excited, but also industry excited about a project like this. The timing is good. Now, regardless of how you feel about President Trump, I think he's got it right on the water issue. Water may be the most important issue we face for the next generation. That's a direct quote. His infrastructure plan is looking at spending $1 trillion. I know we haven't heard much about it. He's been busy with other things. But he's looking for transformative projects. 1/10 of the budget would be set aside for exploratory and groundbreaking ideas. In my opinion, looking offshore for fresh water is transformative, all right? He's also very interested in trying to come up with drinking water, clean water, drinking water, and energy and telecommunications. Again, I think we can combine these a project offshore with these particular elements. Another place that actually funds some of this work is the International Ocean Discovery Program. They fund drilling programs on the order of about $150 million a year, but that funding has been declining through time, and it actually expires relatively soon. All right. More good timing. You've probably been reading in the newspaper that the state of Oregon has embarked on a 100-year water vision. In fact, the very first meeting was held in Gresham, I believe, just this past week. All right, and if you haven't visited the website, I suggest that you do to get a feel for what the mission is, the mission statement, and the vision. But I think the goals align well with trying to do something offshore. And the reason is I think they're looking for trying to find safe water supply projects, resilient to earthquakes, to floods. And I don't know, I can't think of a better place than trying to be developing something under 300 feet of water. All right? There's other people already looking offshore. I mentioned to you that there's the wind energy people are looking at trying to do something with floating turbines south of Coos Bay. And the reason is they've recognized there's no other options for hydropower. Their options are offshore, and we need to look at them very closely. I think we could do that in tandem with the offshore wind energy companies. The Oregon Travel Commission has this tagline, Oregon, we love dreamers. Well, I'm proud to say I'm a dreamer, all right? But I'm not the only one. Nobody would, if you think there's nobody crazy enough to do this, Malta is actually, I think, the furthest along with respect to countries actively looking at developing groundwater underneath the ocean for drinking water supply. And I thank you for your attention. Are there any questions? Yes.
Bill? What kind of volume are you thinking exists out there?
What kind of volume do I think would exist out there? I don't know. I know that the volume that the Mid-Coast Planning Project was shooting for as far as a peak day demand, I believe, was on the order of 20 million gallons per day. I think if we were to say, if we found the volcanic rocks as productive as we find in onshore, in like the Columbia River basalts in the near Warren, Oregon, for example, many of those wells would make anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million gallons of water per day. So that's from an individual vertical well. I don't know what a horizontal well in those same rocks might produce. But let's think about that a little bit. What has transformed the American energy industry? It was horizontal drilling. So the United States went from a net importer of energy to a net exporter through drilling technology, and it's primarily through the horizontal drilling technology. So I think we can extrapolate their success to the water sector.
What leads you to think that there's enough supply out there that's a significant, or to make it worth the investment?
That's a great question. What makes me think that there's enough supply to justify the investment? So one of the things that the groundwater engineering community thinks with respect to subsea aquifers is that there's 100 times more water stored under the ocean that we could use than we've ever pumped off the land. Yes?
Mine has to do with the salinity, if I remember this correctly, well, 5 parts per, is it million or billion?
35,000 parts per million would be seawater.
Right, and you said 5,000 for what's in these holding places compared to 500.
Right,
that we use.
right.
So with that salinity difference, would some desalination technology have to be used, or are there easier ways to make that closer to 500 more
Yes.
usable?
Okay, that's a good question. So let's say it's an average. I don't know what the actual numbers are. It's going to be highly variable. I just pulled out the 5,000 to say that it's not seawater. But in some places it's going to be a little bit more, maybe much less in other areas. Would some treatment technology still be needed, and would it have to be quite as extensive as desalination? The answer is it probably wouldn't be desal. It'd probably be some sort of distillation process that maybe actually there's researchers at Oregon State University Cascades campus that are actually pioneering this distillation process to make it more potable. But it's hard to say. I mean, it may take very little treatment, or maybe it can be dealt with through combining with other sources, meaning maybe we combine it with some aquifer storage and recovery water, and we blend it down to where it becomes more acceptable. I mean, there's a lot of options that we already have to do anyway with some of the water that's onshore, meaning that some of the water quality may be very high with respect to arsenic. And we already go through that process of blending to make it acceptable so that it's potable.
Will the same fractures in the rocks that allow the fresh water to go in through those layers in the first place, doesn't that allow the salt water in now? It's above it?
That's a good question, but and the answer is that the layers of rock in between the volcanic rocks, at least based on the drilling logs that are available, the 7 wells that have already been drilled, is the intervening layers are actually very low permeability siltstones and clays. You're welcome. Yes?
Maybe you can help me come up with some logic. I'm all for research, and I think the more we know, the better off we are. But we're talking about fresh drinking water for people, right? It seems to me the money that would be spent to this, to start off with, would make a lot more sense being spent on conservation issues and teaching people the value of the water to begin with. As you started, we don't have data. We have people with, to put it very bluntly, straws in streams, pulling out water willy-nilly without any numbers knowing how much they're taking. We're drying our above surface water by doing these things. If you look around the world, we're draining our aquifers way more than they're getting replenished naturally. A lot of that drainage is causing subsidence. Who's to say that draining an offshore aquifer is not going to cause subsidence and then again earthquake issues? I just seem to think that looking to be draining aquifers off the coast, as interesting as it might be, is jumping the gun from where we should really be looking at respecting the resource to begin with, doing conservation, and then the idea of selling water as a commodity seems to me that now we're also getting big business and making it a money-making profitability structure for companies like Nestle, where this is a resource that is desperately needed by everyone on the planet, including our non-human fellow citizens. I think this might be jumping the gun before we start doing what we need to be doing as a human race to think about how we're using our resources. So I don't know if my logic holds up, but I'm having trouble listening to this kind of concept.
Understood. So you think that we, as humans, should do a better job of conserving the water?
To begin with, yes.
Yeah, and you're not going to get any pushback from me. But I think we've been trying to do that for a long time. And then the other issue is I fully support conservation of water, and I fully support water measurement, because I think we need to do a better job of trying to measure what we're using, because you can't manage what you don't measure. I think we all know that just from our checking books, right? But that's not occurring. And then the other thing that we have a problem with is we have some changes that are occurring Some people call it climate change, climate chaos. Change is occurring. And I think people are starting to move around. And they're moving into places where there's the perception that there is an abundance of water. I think we'll probably see a few people moving to Oregon because of that. So I think, I don't think we're going to be able to slow down that demand end of the equation. I think the conservation may delay things, but I think we're still going to have to deal with coming up with different options for storage and supply. And I'm not trying to pitch this as an either-or situation of you should not build any more dams. I think this is an option to building dams. I think it's a supplement to storing water in addition to dams that we might need, or to other bulk water transfers that may be occurring. So I don't know how to directly answer your question. Is it jumping the gun? I think everybody's searching for more supply because there's an increasing amount of demand associated with population increasing, with changes in where the distribution of water is today.
But we also have, with that increasing number of population, there should be a balance, in my view, in what we mandate. So we have a lot of technological knowledge in recycling of water, in bioremediation. We have living buildings that generate more water and clean the waters as they are utilized. We have all of these technological things that we could be mandating in our built environment. When we say, if you're going to build a new building, you have to have recycled water, you have to have X, Y, and Z, which would slow down our use again. So I just, again, think there's a lot more than storing water or damming rivers or drilling that we need to be doing right now.
I don't disagree. But I'm just offering options here.
Yeah, no, I
because
understand. I mean, the research is great.
You've just gone through a very extensive planning program, and it says you need to store more water. And I think conservation was built into that planning process, and yet the result was still you need more water. So all I'm pitching here is maybe this is an option that should be considered, because it certainly seems within the ballpark with respect to the anticipated cost for doing additional water development on land. And I think it's an underutilized resource from the standpoint of, I think many times we just think, well, we can't do anything because there's seawater there. And I don't think that's the case. We've been doing lots offshore. We plan on doing even more offshore with respect to developing energy, both through waves as well as wind. So I'm not trying to pitch it as this will save everything. I'm just saying this is an option, and we're not the only ones thinking about this. We're seeing it seriously being considered on the East Coast to accommodate water supply problems there, and the Europeans are very active in it. I'm working with African researchers for Cape Town, which is looking at where they actually think they're going to run out of water. So this makes perfect sense for being part of their water portfolio. Yes?
She had a question too.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Wouldn't it be a wonderful device to have in case of a tsunami or a disruption of dams and things like that, to be able to use this in an emergency basis?
Yeah, you're asking about resiliency, earthquakes. I think the biggest concern with some of the dams are, will they hold up? I mean, will they fall apart? I don't know. I mean, that's a geotechnical engineering project unto itself. But with respect to shaking, I think something underwater or off the ocean, the coast, is probably more resilient to any sort of a shaking or a tsunami situation.
Your pipe will fail. Your pipe will fail when we have a 9.4 earthquake.
Well,
If you think anything other than that, you don't understand engineering well enough.
Well, I don't profess to be a pipeline engineer,
Okay.
but the pipeline that could be used is a plastic pipeline. It's already being used off the coast of Turkey to supply water to Cyprus. So I'm not saying that it probably wouldn't work. I just think it would take an awful lot of sheer stress to probably shear a plastic pipe as opposed to a concrete pipe or a steel pipe.
Can I ask my questions now, please?
Yes?
Is the undersea water, virgin water, unrenewable naturally? In other words, it was put there a long, long time ago, and there's no natural renewable resource.
We don't know that with a high degree of certainty, but I can respond to your question with respect to are we mining water. We mine water every time we turn on a pump, on land or offshore, right? So in Oregon, we already are mining upwards to 500 feet of water level change in the Umatilla Basin, in the volcanic rocks, over the past 50 years. It's not the depth of water, it's how much the water level has changed. And that water's been dated at 20,000 years old. So we're already mining water. We're mining water in the Willamette Valley. They have many different groundwater limited areas in the Willamette Valley that are recognized that we are mining the groundwater, but they haven't stopped drilling wells. So you're right. This could be a potentially non-renewable groundwater resource, but that's nothing new because we're mining water all over the world.
And we're depleting our sources all over the world.
Yes.
You said that most of the undersea water was in the marine reserves. Is that where you are drilling for water undersea in the marine reserves?
No.
No.
No, I was suggesting that the marine reserves might actually reflect where the groundwater is discharging.
Okay.
As submarine springs. And as far as targeting marine reserves, well, I think our objective with respect to developing that map was to make a first attempt at trying to identify areas that may not necessarily be targeted. I'll go back here first and then you.
Could you describe the electromagnetic physics imaging that they use to find the one in the Northeast?
No, I can't, because I'm not a geophysicist. But they are actually, very actively using geophysical techniques to map out the fresh water off the shore of Massachusetts. But I'm not conversant enough as a geophysicist to help you understand. I don't fully understand how it works myself, so I apologize for that. You had a question.
You said the 70 wells that were drilled, and there was a tremendous amount of information stored. Is there any projects set up for undergraduate to graduate students to go through these and classify them, look for whatever it is you want to look for, and as a good starting point before they go build new well?
Yes. I'd love to have an undergraduate or graduate student complete this work for an honors thesis project or a master's thesis project. It just takes money, and I haven't found the funding yet to fund a student to undertake that exercise. So what we've done so far has been courtesy of the small federal grant that we received to operate the water center. I will say that the USGS, though, has been very supportive of our work. But they don't provide the funding at the level that we need to fund a student. Yes?
Something of desalination came up before. What's the cost differential and energy differential in desalinating water compared to trying to mine water that's...
Yeah, the only comparison that I made was just something along the California coast that's a current project in Monterey. So the Monterey project was a desal and groundwater development project. And the estimated costs were $300 million, and I estimated at the top end of a drilling project that would be combined with other research enterprises on the order of $100 million. I came up with that number just because numbers that large get the attention of vice presidents of research.
What about the cost per unit of water that's produced? Like,
Oh,
per
well, that's a
gallon?
good question. I don't know. I mean, I think that would be a function of getting a better feel for how much we could anticipate from a platform that was targeting multiple areas through many different wells that could be drilled off of a single platform.
Seeing that is a limited resource, which is not renewable, you have a much bigger resource by desalinating seawater.
That's true. Or you could, I mean, anytime you mine the groundwater, that's space that can be refilled with water. And so we can treat water and put the water back into the ground ourselves. So yeah, a depleted aquifer is not necessarily a nuisance. I consider it an asset. We can refill it with stormwater. And
Well, I suggested they do that when they had the train fire and the one city completely depleted their water, all of their water for their community trying to put out that train fire. And I suggested that they do just exactly that, haul water in, refill their system manually. I don't know what they did, but it was at least renewable in the sense that over time it would refill.
Mhm.
But for an immediate solution, refilling it would have been a good solution.
Right. Well, there's pushback with aquifer storage and recovery, even though it makes perfect sense to think about it. There's pushback even in Salem, which has the very first permitted aquifer storage and recovery system in the state, even though they're facing a problem with their surface water supplies through these harmful algal blooms. The pushback is we don't like the taste of the water.
So they are trying to refill the aquifer?
In Salem, yes, they have the very first permit in Oregon to do it. They've been doing it for over 20, 25 years.
There's a question in the back.
Yes.
Yeah, you were referring to developments in drilling technology that have benefited the oil and gas industry, and you referred to horizontal drilling and how these technologies could be used offshore. Are you suggesting using hydraulic fracking to drill these wells?
Hydraulic fracking could be used in an aquifer development since it has been for many decades. The difference between the traditional hydraulic fracking for the oil and gas industry is, the chemicals that you hear, the witch's brew, that's actually designed for the actual formation itself, meaning these are typically fracking, low permeability reservoir rocks, and so they have to deal with the geochemistry of the formation, the shales and the clay. When we're dealing with these very hard rocks to begin with, like the volcanic rocks, there are hydraulic stimulation techniques that have been used under a research approach looking at fully evaluating all of the potential impacts in water wells that date back 30 years ago. And we're finding that there's very little impact to the water quality when we're using a hydraulic stimulation technique that is designed to protect the aquifer and the water quality. But to compare what the oil and gas industry is using today in their horizontal wells to the water well industry is comparing apples with oranges because they have two different goals completely.
Right, I was just hoping that you weren't suggesting that we pump poisons into an
No, of
aquifer that
course
we're
not.
developing.
Of course not. But I mean, to say that that there is no hydraulic stimulation that's underway in the water well industry, it's been underway for decades.
Okay, let's take
Thank
this
you.
question, this one here, and then we'll close. Yes.
So as I understand it, you think that there's possible freshwater seepage into the saltwater basin through freshwater springs? If we pump out water through a drilling method, what would fill the void if not salt water? If there is already a permeable layer that allows that fresh water to seep up into the marine reserves, and we pump out that aquifer, something has to fill that void. Would that not be salt water?
It could be. I mean, that's part of the, I think that's one of the unknowns that we need to do further research on. I think we're smarter about seawater intrusion than we were 50 years ago when it occurred in the LA Basin in California. We know that we can create situations where we can prohibit that from occurring. But I mean, that's a reasonable question. Could we create an opportunity for saltwater intrusion? Sure, but I think the only way that we can actually assess that and figure out ways to control that is actually get out there and get some data.
One last question.
I'm a member of the Mid-Coast Water Planning Partnership.
Mm-hmm.
I'm on all the working groups.
Mm-hmm.
The question I have is, could we put water storage into the Siletz River upper volcanic zone for freshwater storage from winter runoff?
I think there's a potential for doing that. I'm not familiar with where that is located on shore, but I'll give you an example of what.
Up above Siletz and up above the gorge, the Siletz River Gorge,
Okay.
up above that area. There's a lot of volcanic,
Sure.
old volcanic.
Sure. I think there's a lot of opportunity on the coastal range for doing aquifer storage on land, not subsea. And we already know this because Warren, Oregon just recently completed a very important aquifer storage and recovery project in the Columbia River basalts where the well was drilled and it was pump tested, and they recognized that they were dealing with a compartmentalized aquifer, meaning a box aquifer. They just drained all of the water in the box. And so they determined, wait a minute, this box has more value to us than a well because we can actually pump water into it and store the water there instead of building a 2 million gallon storage tank that is subjected to a large footprint and is subjected to shaking. So now they have a 6 million gallon underground storage tank that the only access point to it is a vertical well.
Where's that at again?
Warren, Oregon.
Where's that?
So, but the oil and gas industry, just to kind of circle back to where we started with them, they're smart about these coastal range aquifers or reservoirs as well. They, decades ago, tried looking for oil and gas in the mist area in Columbia County. And what they found is that they found the gas, but they also found that it was also compartmentalized, and so that the gas field itself is actually more valuable for storing gas than it is for developing gas. So that's another example that, yes, I think there's lots of opportunity for storing things. Beyond just water, we can also store energy and waste in these compartmentalized zones within the coastal range.
Okay, great questions. So let's get it. And assuming I'll be around if you want to talk to them for a few minutes afterwards. Thank you all for coming. It was interesting to talk, and I think it points to another alternative.